He didn't say his name, not a word. But in his eyes was something that screamed louder than any cry for help I'd ever heard in war. In war, we learn to listen beyond what we hear, to distinguish the urgency of a scream from the weight of a gaze. There are things that don't come from the throat. They come from within, and burn, soundless. I was a nurse in a field hospital in the frozen heart of Belgium, and each night seemed to last a lifetime. The cold seeped into our bones. But there was something else that froze us. Absence. Those who arrived without a name, without a number, without a past. Sometimes without a pulse. Other times with too many beats, as if the heart were trying to remember what the mind had erased. He arrived like that, carried by 2 snow-covered soldiers covered up to his face. I'd seen too many bodies, but this one, he was breathing. Weak, but breathing. No records, no identification. No sign of where he'd come from or where he was supposed to be going. But when I opened his eyes with my thumb, it was as if a crack had opened in my own silence. There was something in that gaze that sought me out. It wasn't pleading with words, but with what was left when all words were gone. I should have ignored him. It wasn't my place to care for someone not on the list, someone who, for obvious or dangerous reasons, no one seemed to want. But there, amid the stained sheets and the smell of ether, I felt something that didn't come from nursing textbooks. It was as if he were asking me to exist, and I accepted. No promise, no reason. Just because. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to listen to what has no sound. My name is Doris Ann Whitfield. I'm 88 years old, and I live alone in a small wooden house in Vermont, where the fireplace creaks more than it speaks, and my cat sleeps all day in the window, as if watching over something I've already forgotten. My hair is white as frost, tied in a loose bun, and my hands no longer hold needles. But they do hold memories, and these sometimes weigh more than any wound I've ever carried. I wear my woolen clothes, drink strong tea, and speak little. But there's one thing that won't leave me. Something no one recorded but which remains here sewn between my ribs. It's about that man, that nameless wounded man, and his silence that, to this day, speaks within me. Please sit here with me, because this story didn't make the papers, but it lives within me as if it were yesterday. And if you feel like you have memories that only come alive when they're told, then subscribe to the channel. This is a safe place. And sometimes, hearing a story is like embracing an old pain with a little more tenderness. I remember the door bursting open that late afternoon. The shelter's canvas trembled in the wind, bringing ice through the cracks. 2 young men from the medical battalion entered, carrying a body, or nearly so. He was wrapped in a dark gray blanket, stained with dried blood and melted snow. From a distance, he looked more like a heavy sack than a man. But I could see right away that there was still life. A life hidden inside, snoring softly as if fighting to stay awake. No one said much. Just, "We have no record. He was found near the western clearing." And that was it. A short sentence, a heavy weight. I zipped up my coat, washed my hands in a cold bucket, and went to him. As I slowly pulled back the blanket, I had the feeling he already knew I was there, as if he'd been waiting for me, even though, theoretically, that was impossible. His face was bruised, his nose looked broken, and there were fresh cuts above his eyebrows, as if he'd been pierced by thorns or shrapnel. But his eyes were open and alive. They weren't the eyes of someone who'd just arrived. They were eyes that had already seen too much, and perhaps that was why they said nothing. He didn't speak. His lips didn't move. He just stared at me, not with despair Not with fear, but with something more intimate. As if there was a history between us that I myself hadn't yet known. It was a look, resigned. As if he'd accepted that this was the end but still wanted to leave something with me. "Do you know his name?" I asked one of the soldiers who brought him in. They shook their heads. Nothing, no identification. He was just lying there in the bushes, moaning. He had no weapon. He had no backpack. He didn't even have proper boots. I bent down and touched his pulse. Weak, but steady. His left arm felt dislocated. The right side of his chest had a purple spot that pulsed slowly, like a warning that something inside him was about to rupture. "Can he speak?" I asked again. Another silence. Then I saw it. He tried to move his mouth, but no sound came out. Just an effort, a tremor at the corner of his jaw. And then, his gaze. So fixed, so full of something that hurt more than the wound itself. I'd seen men bleeding before. I'd smelled fear, death, fever. But that silence was different. It was as if his body was crying out for help. But his soul wasn't sure it wanted to be found. And yet, something inside me had already responded. Before I'd even thought, before any order. I knew. He wasn't just a nameless, wounded man. He was a mirror. And what I saw in him, somehow, was what I'd hidden inside myself for too long. That winter of 1944, the cold wasn't just outside. The forest fell silent at dusk, as if it too were waiting for some news that never arrived. The wet wood creaked beneath our feet. The blankets felt like paper, and the breath of the wounded created tiny ghosts in the air. But inside me, a strange warmth began to blossom. A warmth that didn't come from the stove or the weak tea we distributed among the stretchers. It was his, from that nameless man who never said a word and yet occupied every inch of my thoughts. I tried to do what a nurse was supposed to do. Take his fever, clean his wounds, change his bandages. My movements were automatic, but my chest wasn't. Every time I touched him, even with gloves on, I felt as if a part of me was being examined too, as if he saw something in me that I couldn't even name anymore. The idea was absurd. Of course it was. But in war, logic is the first language we forget. And before I knew it, I was already placing my hand on his blanket, a little more slowly, taking a few extra seconds to pull away, thinking of excuses to go back and check just one more time to see if he was breathing properly. The curious thing is he never touched me. He never raised his hand, never tried to speak to me. But it was as if he enveloped me completely. When I went to wash the dirty clothes, I could still smell him clinging to the collar of my coat. An indefinable smell. Not cologne. Not sweat. Not blood. It was like wet wood. Like turned earth. Like clothes stored away for too long. And I, who used to run through the hospital corridors, now walked more slowly when I passed his bed, as if willing time to pass slowly there. Some of the other nurses began to notice. "You're always the first to change that one's dressings," Martha said one night, with a wry smile. I didn't respond. I just looked away, as if unwilling to reveal even to herself what she already understood. But it wasn't just attraction. It wasn't a fantasy amidst the chaos. It was a deep connection. A silent one. A feeling that he knew me without knowing why. And that was perhaps what kept me up at night the most. Because the only thing more disturbing than loving someone you don't know is feeling like that someone knows you. And that's when I started keeping his bandages separately. Not for medical reasons, but because somehow I wanted to preserve every mark, every thread of gauze that touched that body that didn't speak its name. As if I were trying to piece together a puzzle with pieces of silence. And maybe, of myself. In the army, everything has a number. Accommodations have a number. Meals have a number. Bodies too. Even our tears seem to have a set time. But he was an exception. And every exception back then carried danger. Commanders liked lists. Lists gave order to the absurd. But his name was nowhere to be found. Not a name tag, not an inside pocket, not a hidden seam on his shirt. I looked. At first, out of obligation. Then, for something else I couldn't name. I often remember that weekend as one of the quietest I've ever experienced. And that, even in a field hospital in the middle of Belgium, is saying a lot. The other wounded were mumbling, calling for their mothers, asking for morphine. Not him. He just breathed, with the restrained way of someone who seems to apologize for still being alive. And I walked around with that anguish that starts in the back of my neck and slowly descends until it tightens my chest. It was one freezing morning, as I was wiping his forehead with a warm cloth, that I noticed he had a scar near his left ear, small, but deep, the kind that grows over time, or with punishment. I touched it lightly, and in that instant he moved his eyes as if he'd felt it. But he didn't move away, and I understood that the mark was the closest thing he could give me to a name. The main wound, the one that justified his presence there, was in his chest. There was no deep puncture wound, but the bone ached, maybe a blow, maybe an old hole, reopened from within. And look, it's strange to say this about a stranger, but caring for him was like running your hands over a letter with no return address. Every time I cleaned the wound, I felt like that skin was trying to tell me something. As if the pain he carried had no edge, no center. It just spread like an ink stain on a wet cloth. I tried to investigate from the outside. I spoke to soldiers, doctors, even the cook who swore he'd seen him before, but couldn't remember where. No one knew. No one wanted to know. And that, more than anything, kept me alert. Because in war, sometimes what no one wants to see is exactly what needs to be looked at most. One night, I discreetly opened the closet where we kept the wounded's torn clothes. I took out his shirt. I examined every seam, every tear. No name, no number. Just the blood-stained fabric. And something hand-embroidered on the left cuff. 2 letters. A.W. It gave me chills. Not because it was familiar, but because he used handwriting. Very similar to my sister's. The one who died before the war. The one who sewed on my clothes when we were children. I took a deep breath. I tucked my shirt in again. And I tucked it away like someone hiding a secret they don't yet understand. Because at that moment, I knew I was going too far. But I also knew it was too late to turn back. Gunshots are frightening. But silence, oh silence, it eats away at you. Especially when it comes from the one who should be screaming. In the field hospital, we were accustomed to the sound of horror. Bones breaking, muffled groans, dying sighs. But what came from him was a kind of absence that filled the space strangely. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for help. He didn't struggle. It was as if he were on the other side of a glass panel, alive but unreachable. Sometimes I wondered if he was really there, because there were moments when he simply disappeared. Not from his body, of course, but from his gaze. He would stare at the ceiling as if he were seeing something else. Another time, another place. His hand would twitch slightly, as if holding something invisible. A memory, perhaps, or guilt. There was one day in particular that I've never forgotten. I was changing the bandage on his arm, slowly, because the skin was sensitive and had already begun to heal. He wasn't moving, only breathing shallowly. That's when I noticed his eyes were wet. It wasn't a full-blown cry. It was a single tear, running slowly down the side of his face, mixing with the sweat and dust. And yet, it paralyzed me, because it was the first time he'd shown me pain. Not a physical pain, but the other kind. The one that comes from within and has no remedy. I paused for a second, my hand suspended, gauze halfway there. And he, without moving his head, looked at me. It was as if to say, "Do you see me?" And in that instant, I saw everything he wasn't saying. I saw the desperation locked between his teeth, the swallowed screams, the stifled plea of someone who perhaps no longer knew why he was there. I started talking to him. Simple things. About the weather, the night shift, the watery soup we were serving. I didn't expect an answer. But something inside me needed to build a bridge, even if he never crossed. And every day I returned, I talked more. I read little excerpts from old letters. I told stories from my childhood. About how my sister braided my hair. About how my dad whistled before coming home. And he just listened. But he listened as if every word I said was being written down deep inside, in the part of him that still worked. The other nurses thought it was a waste of time. If he doesn't speak, it's not out of politeness, Doris. It's out of fear or strategy. I didn't disagree, but I also didn't stop, because that silence hurt, and it was a pain that somehow I recognized, because I too spent a long time unable to say who I was, what I felt, and sometimes we just need someone to be there, listening to what wasn't said, until their presence becomes, in itself, an answer. It was dawn. The kind of dawn when the wind whistles through the cracks in the canvas as if calling our names, testing our endurance. The outpost's generator hissed softly, almost without power, and the light wavered as if time itself hesitated to continue. I walked slowly between the beds, checking vital signs, arranging bandages, distracting myself from the news that had arrived that night. More casualties, more missing. He was paler than usual. His breathing was still rhythmic, but with pauses that were too long between them. I moved closer and pulled the sheet up to his chest. I was about to adjust the pillow when I felt it. His hand, weak but firm, gripped my sleeve. Not tightly, but with something more unsettling. Intention. A tiny gesture, but full of restrained urgency, as if, finally, he were saying something, without a voice, but with his whole body. I froze for a second. I looked at him. His eyes were open, fixed on mine, and there was a quiet desperation there, like someone holding a train about to derail inside their chest. His hand didn't tremble. He didn't plead. He just clung to me, as if that night, that very night, was his last chance to avoid disappearing forever. I held him back. I squeezed his fingers lightly, as if to say, "I'm here." And for a few seconds we stayed like that, connected by an invisible thread between what he couldn't say and what I was beginning to understand. Then he let go. He slowly returned his arm to his side. But something had changed, because in that touch, in that simple gesture, something inside me snapped, like a button breaking mid-stitch, like a window suddenly opening in a house closed for years. And I found myself crying. No fuss, just 2 warm tears that fell onto the white sheet. I didn't know why, but then I didn't need to know. That's when I realized he didn't want to be saved. At least, not in the way I imagined. Maybe it wasn't his body crying out for help. Maybe it was the rest of him, what was left, what still bled silently. And it was in that moment, in that ragged breath between one gesture and the next, that I understood that caring for him would be more than cleaning wounds. It would be trying to hold a piece of truth, that not even he seemed ready to hold alone. In war, we learn to identify a man by the fabric he's dressed in, the color of his uniform, the cut of his coat, the buttons, the patches. Everything speaks volumes. Everything reveals which side he's on, where he came from, what he carries on his shoulders. But his coat, that coat was an enigma. It hung on the wooden post behind the bed for days. No one dared touch it. It was heavy, dark, stained with varying shades of earth and rust. The collar was ripped on one side, as if it had been pulled violently, and the buttons, 4 of them, didn't match any military model I knew. Not American, not German, not local troops. It was as if it had been sewn in a hurry, or with ulterior motives. That morning I gathered my courage. The weather was freezing outside, and inside the tent the water barely warmed. I grabbed the coat like someone grabbing a letter that arrived too late. The fabric was thick, strange to the touch. It smelled of wet grass mixed with dried blood. But there was something there, something that pulled me. I turned the garment inside out. I examined the seams, the pockets. Inside the lining on the right side, I found a small, poorly mended tear. A handmade, hurried cut, as if someone had hidden or removed something from there. A secret pocket, perhaps. But now, empty. I showed the coat to one of the medical captains. He frowned. "It's not ours, and it doesn't belong to any of the Allied regiments." Then he ran his hand over the collar and whispered, "Maybe it belonged to someone who didn't want to be identified." I returned to the tent with the coat folded in my arms. I sat beside his bed, and as if he'd been waiting, he opened his eyes and fixed them on the garment I carried. He didn't say anything, as always, but for the first time his eyes trembled. Not with fear, with memory. That garment. It was a memory he still wore inside, even without a body. I laid the coat over his legs and watched his right hand move slowly until it touched the sleeve. His fingers glided over the fabric, pausing at the exact spot of the hidden tear. And then he closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, but he retreated back into himself, like someone visiting a place that hurts. There, in that fold of cloth and silence, I understood that the man hadn't just lost his documents. He had lost, or chosen to lose, himself. And the coat, stained and strange, was all that remained of a past that no longer fit into any list. Not ours, not his. It wasn't a normal sleep. It never was. While others sank into fevers or screaming nightmares, he slept strangely. His eyes never closed completely. They were always half open. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack, but enough for me to realize he was somehow always alert. Or maybe trapped, like someone sleeping in a minefield inside their own head. At first I thought it was a muscle reflex, or neurological trauma. Some traumatized soldiers developed strange habits after long periods in trenches, eyes that wouldn't close, bodies that curled up on their own, hands that shook even at rest. But with him, it was different. It wasn't involuntary. It was as if he chose to sleep like this, as if he couldn't, or didn't want to, give himself over completely to rest. I began observing him in the early hours of the morning when I couldn't sleep. I'd sit on a makeshift stool beside his bed, a blanket draped over my shoulders, listening to his breathing mingling with the wind outside. And it was always the same. Eyes half open, chest rising and falling slowly, as if struggling to remain in a middle ground between the world here and the world there. Once when I got too close, I saw his eyes move behind his eyelids, not like someone dreaming, but like someone examining, as if even in sleep he were sifting through something. Memories, maybe, or names, or guilt. It was that same night that something happened that still haunts me. I was about to place a damp cloth on his forehead when he murmured something, low, almost imperceptible, a sound that came from his throat, hoarse and indecipherable. I leaned closer and asked, "Did you say something?" But he didn't answer, only the movement of his eyes beneath his lids, more intense now. And then, as if pulled from an inner abyss, he said in the faintest voice I've ever heard, "Don't call me that!" I recoiled. The cloth fell from my hand. The whole room seemed to have stopped. He didn't say anything else. But those words, those 3 words, were like an echo in the void. "Don't call me that." But how? I hadn't called him anything. I didn't know his name. He had a name? I stared at him, trying to figure it out. Was he dreaming? Or was he listening to me all along? What if, in some strange, silent way, he knew who I was, even without remembering who he himself had been? He never spoke in his sleep again. He never called me again. But ever since then, I've had the feeling he's mistaking me for someone else. Someone who perhaps had been a part of his life before. Or worse, someone he's trying to forget. And that's when everything inside me got mixed up. Because the more I cared for him, the more I felt like I was helping someone who, deep down, already knew me. And that scared me more than any explosion outside the tent. It was a late afternoon, when the ice was beginning to melt in thin streams through the folds of the tarp, that it happened. I was bent over trying to straighten a pile of bandages that had fallen from the closet. A roll slipped free and rolled to his bedside. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard a soft thud and saw that his arm splint had slipped to the floor. I reached out to put it back on, but he slowly raised his arm. For the first time since arriving, he moved with intention. He took hold of the splint and, with his still frail fingers, began to reposition it. But not like a patient accustomed to their own body. No, he did it as I would, precisely, with technique, with the precise gesture of someone who'd done it before. Many times. I watched in silence, and that's when he took the gauze, correctly, firmly, without hesitation, and began wrapping it around his wrist, the way he passed under, crossed over, and wrapped it all the way around, without leaving any slack. It was the same way I'd learned in training. It wasn't a reflex, it was memory, muscular technique, a skill that's engraved in the skin, not just in the mind. "Have you ever been a doctor?" I asked, a whisper that almost escaped me. He didn't answer, nor did he pause, but he blinked slowly, and at the corner of his mouth, I swear I saw a trace of a smile, small, trembling, almost sad, as if to say, "I was something once, but I don't know what else." After finishing the bandage, he released the end and extended his arm, offering me the last piece as if asking for help without diminishing himself. I took it from his hand, and in that touch, I felt something else. His palms were rough, calloused, not from carrying weapons, but from carrying people. The same marks I'd seen on other nurses, the marks left when we hold a life between our fingers for too long. I began to wonder, who was he really? An undercover doctor? A nurse who deserted? A man who saw too much and chose silence as his hiding place? Or worse, someone who saw in me something he himself had left behind. That night, as I folded the clean cloths, I thought about his hands, the precision, the care, and I found myself remembering my father's hands. And my sister's, who braided my hair with the same delicacy with which he wrapped that gauze. Memory is a treacherous thing. It slips through the days, but sometimes reveals itself in gestures that the body still remembers, even when the mind has forgotten. And I began to realize that perhaps he had been trying to tell me something all along, not with words, but with his hands, with gestures, with that which survives erasure. That night the hospital was busier than usual. 2 trucks had arrived with injured people from the north. The ground was still soggy from the last snowfall, and the smell of fresh blood mixed with mud seeped into our boots without asking for permission. I ran from one stretcher to the next, trying to remain calm, distributing blankets, IVs, and care. But even amidst the chaos, something inside me couldn't stop thinking about him. When things calmed down a bit, I went to his bed. He was the same, quiet, half awake, his eyes following the movements around him with a strange lucidity. I approached him with a bowl of thin soup. He didn't move, but his eyes turned me slightly to the side, as if trying to warn me of something I couldn't yet see. Then I heard it, a whisper coming from 2 beds behind, 2 officers, a medical captain, and a newly arrived commander. They were speaking softly, but the chilly night wind carried their words more clearly than they could have imagined. One of them said, "There's something wrong with that one." My whole body stiffened. I continued stirring the spoon in the bowl, as if nothing had happened, but my breath caught. The other man replied, "No one knows where he came from. No records. No patrols reported him missing. Either he's lying, or he shouldn't be here." Then, silence. The footsteps receded, and I remained there, motionless, with the sound of those phrases echoing within my chest. My gaze went to him, and as if he had heard everything, even from a distance, even with the whispers, he looked at me, not with fear, but with a restrained plea. I can't explain it, but it was as if he were saying, "You heard. What now?" The spoon slipped from my hand. It fell into the soup, which splashed onto my sleeve. But I didn't move. I felt a strange pain in my stomach, as if I'd been pulled into a place where I had no choice. Because now, it wasn't just about who he was. It was about what he was hiding, or what I was willing to hide along with it. And it was at that moment that the question pierced me like a silent blade. What if what he pretended to forget was exactly what I couldn't remember? I had it stuck in my throat for the rest of the night. I changed his bandages as usual. I gathered the cloths, cleaned the instruments, turned out the lamps. But the world felt different, as if I'd crossed an invisible line, and everything inside me whispered, soundlessly, voicelessly, that now I was with him. In the silence, in the risk, in the secret. That night carried a kind of unease that didn't come solely from the cold or the fresh blood on the sheets. It was as if the very air inside the tent was thicker, more alert. 2 trucks had arrived with wounded from the north, and the hospital was filled with a silent rush, the kind that manifests itself not in shouts but in hurried glances, hands that tremble while feigning precision, footsteps that intersect without clear direction. As I organized the stretchers and distributed the blankets, my thoughts were divided into 2, what I was doing and what he was carrying. There was a growing unease around me. Some faces stared at his bed with a mixture of doubt and distance. There were gestures that were too restrained, short silences that preceded changes of subject, a weight that accumulated around him, as if his presence, so quiet, was beginning to crack the ground everyone pretended was solid. I passed 2 superior officers and felt the way they leaned in, exchanging muffled words. I didn't need to hear anything clearly to understand. Their posture, their half-closed eyes, the brief glance they cast in his direction, before continuing on their way. All of this said more than any sentence could. Their bodies communicated what protocol would never say out loud. There was distrust. Something didn't quite fit. And the fact that no one wanted to talk about it openly only heightened the risk. I continued my work, but with a new tension in my chest. When I finally approached his bed, my steps were heavier. The bowl of soup I held trembled slightly, and the sound of the warm liquid hitting the edges seemed louder than it should have been. As I leaned in, I felt a chill on the back of my neck, as if being watched from within. His eyes were open. They stared at me, without accusation, but with awareness. A kind of silent lucidity, like someone who understands more than they should and chooses silence as a shield. It was then that I understood. He knew the ground around him was beginning to crack. And yet, he remained still. It wasn't fear. It was choice. Like someone who had already accepted the depth of the hole, and now only wondered who else would fall with him. The spoon fell from my hand. It hit the ceramic with a dull thud, waking me from within. I glanced at the dirty cloth on my sleeve. Nothing seemed right. And yet, there I was, standing between him and a world that was beginning to move too cautiously. It was strange to realize that no one accused him, but everyone avoided approaching, as if the danger wasn't in him, but in what he represented, in what his absence exposed in others, and in me. I went to sleep feeling like I'd already chosen a side, even without words, even without understanding what exactly I was protecting. And for the first time, what weighed on me wasn't what I knew, but what I might have forgotten too. It was an instant. One of those moments when time seems to fold in on itself, as if memory were blowing through the cracks of the present. I was bent down, changing the bandage near his neck, trying to avoid the more sensitive bruises that were beginning to fade, when that scent reached me. It wasn't strong. It wasn't obvious. But it was there, subtle, persistent, escaping from the fold between collar and skin, and it was like being thrust back in time, without warning. A sweet, slightly floral scent, with something ancient, stored away. It was the same perfume my sister wore when we were girls. The same. As if it had crossed decades, fields, languages, and battles just to find me there, in that freezing dawn, on that bed. I stood still for a second, the damp cloth dripping between my fingers. His face was turned to the side, serene, distant. But the smell drew me in. I saw, for a brief moment, my sister before me, braiding my hair while humming softly. I remembered the frosted glass bottle on the vanity, the way she'd dab a drop behind her ears and smile, like someone carrying a secret too beautiful to share. But there was no way. She died before the war. She died young, never knowing this world of boots and trenches, never crossing the ocean. And that perfume was buried with her. I came to, my eyes watering. I adjusted the bandage more carefully than necessary. I couldn't help but look at him as if searching for something beyond the flesh, beyond the wound. But nothing gave me away. No gesture, no sign. Just that body lying there, enveloped in silence, and now perfumed by an absence too ancient to explain. I spent the rest of the shift gripped by a restlessness I couldn't name. I tried to ignore it. I distracted myself with other tasks. But every time I returned to him, the memory came back. It was as if that scent were an invitation, or a warning. As if time wasn't as linear as they say. As if for some strange and painful reason, pieces of me were finding in him a reflection I never expected to see back. In war, everything has a sound, a name, a function. But that moment, it was just a smell. And it broke me. Because sometimes what dismantles us isn't what screams. It's what whispers beneath the skin. And that night, the past didn't need to knock on the door. It simply exhaled. I don't know what made me grab his coat that morning. Maybe it was the unease growing inside me. Maybe it was the smell of the night before, still clinging to the air, or maybe, and this pains me to admit, I was searching for answers in a place where questions didn't even really exist. I picked it up carefully, like someone holding a sacred cloth, and carried it to the back of the tent, near the reservoir where we left our wet clothes to dry on wooden grates. It was lighter than I remembered. The cold had stiffened the fabric, and old stains gave it the look of something long forgotten. I began rummaging inside, a careful, almost complicit gesture. I ran my fingers along the inside seams, the folds, the corners. Nothing in the pockets. Nothing on the torn labels. But when I pressed the inside of the right front, I felt something firm beneath the stitching. A tiny bulge. Almost imperceptible, but present. I used a small pair of tweezers to pull it out, my heart racing and my hands trembling. It was a folded piece of paper, almost palm-sized. It was damp, worn, as if it had endured rain, sweat, and time. I opened it slowly. It was a rough sketch, a rough hand-drawn map, with smudged lines and dots marked with charcoal or a thick pencil. Most of the marks were faded, but a sharply drawn X remained visible, isolated at the bottom edge, almost off-scale. With a chill down my spine, I recognized part of the area where we'd set up our previous outpost. And there, in that corner of the map, was the exact spot where, weeks earlier, our convoy had been ambushed, where 3 nurses had died, and we had to abandon camp in the middle of the night. The same area, the same curved path through the trees. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my apron pocket. I spent the rest of the day feigning normalcy, but everything inside me moved at a different pace. The question now wasn't just who he was, but what he'd been doing before arriving here, and why, of all the possibilities, that piece of map led precisely to my most silent memory. I didn't tell anyone. Not that night. Not afterward. The paper stayed with me, hidden among expired medications and letters I never sent. But its weight was real. The weight of something that shouldn't have been found. Of something he might not even know he still carried. I began to observe his movements more closely. Not out of distrust, but because of that other feeling that arises when we realize something deeply intimate has been touched, even without touching. He slept as always, his eyes half open, his body still. But now, there was a new kind of vigilance in me, as if, somehow, I too had been mapped, and he knew where to find me. The piece was simple. A thin silver chain with a small round medallion, smooth on one side and slightly scratched on the other. A gift from my sister. Years before, everything fell apart. I never took it off. Not during shifts, not in storms. Not when we buried our companions under the thin ice of the forest. It was the only thing that connected me to a time before the war, before the pain, and, in a way, before myself. That morning the cold had receded somewhat. A kind of silence hung over the hospital. It wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. We were all operating at our limits, and the wounded, as if sensing the imminent end of something, remained quieter than usual. I was changing the bandage on his shoulder when the chain of the necklace slipped from under the collar of my blouse and swung in the air, almost touching his skin. It was quick, but enough. He didn't move immediately. Only his eyes moved, sliding toward the metal's faint glow. They remained fixed for a second. Then a strange stiffness took over his body. Not from pain, but from memory, as if something there had turned on an uncomfortable light in some place too dark to be visited without consequences. And then, without a word, without warning, he turned his face away, slowly, restrained, but decisively, like someone who sees something they hadn't expected, or would rather not have recognized. I continued to bandage my freezing hands. My mind was spinning in tight circles, trying to understand. Why would that necklace cause this kind of reaction? It had been made by a small jewelry shop on a forgotten street in Richmond. No religious symbols, no engraved names. Just silver and memory. Just absence and affection. I finished the bandage in silence. I didn't mention the necklace again. But in the following days, I noticed he avoided looking directly at me, as if my face now held something that hurt him. Or maybe something he didn't want to face. I thought about hiding the medal, putting it away, using another scarf. But I couldn't. It was mine. And at the same time, it wasn't just mine anymore. Because now, the simple act of existing with that necklace on my chest meant something neither he nor I were prepared to name. From that moment on, something snapped in the air between us. Not a sudden rupture, but a delicate fracture made of silence and averted gazes. And no matter how hard I tried to return to my previous routine, I knew he had already crossed a line within me. A line drawn by a small, voiceless object, but full of history. As if that medal were a key to a door he had come to avoid. The light rain that afternoon beat down on the canvas roof, as if trying to wash the whole world from the outside, unable to touch what ached inside. I was folding some damp clothes that had been collected from the wounded when I found a worn boot thrown among the dirty cloths. It wasn't uncommon. Often their belongings got mixed up. But that boot was his. You knew it before you even touched it. The worn leather, the lace replaced by a thread of fabric, and a hand-stitched side. Every detail betrayed the improvised nature of someone who officially belonged nowhere. I shook my boot, and something fell out. A piece of paper folded several times, damp at the edges, stained by time and something older. I almost threw it away, but something in me hesitated. I unfolded it carefully, one layer at a time, as if revealing skin too sensitive for direct touch. It was a sheet of paper, handwritten. The letters were slanted, firm, yet emotional. It began with a name that took my breath away. Anne. I read it again. Just one word. But it was as if someone had said my name inside my own body. The paper trembled in my hands. The rest of the sentence was incomplete, as if interrupted by a noise, a start, a sense of remorse. I tried not to forget. Nothing more. No date, no address, no signature. Just that opening and that trail. 2 sentences that seemed to have survived the war in a way that even humans couldn't. And for some reason beyond reason, I knew that letter was for me, even though it wasn't written by anyone who supposedly knew me. Even though it made no sense. Even though there was no proof. I knew. Or worse, I felt. I returned to the tent as if I had passed through another time. I tucked the paper into the inner folds of my apron. I told no one. I couldn't. It was too intimate, too absurd. It was like hearing a voice underwater, muffled, distorted but undeniably familiar. That night I sat beside him, my hands still in my lap. He was asleep, or pretending to be. His face was serene, but his fingers moved slightly, as if they still held a pen, a piece of paper, a memory. I stood there for hours, trying to understand how something so small could open such a large rift within me. I tried to remember if I'd ever met someone with that handwriting. I rummaged through my memories like someone searching for a box in the dark. But all I found was the echo of that unfinished sentence. I tried not to forget. And it was there. There that everything inside me froze. Because for the first time I considered that maybe he knew exactly who I was. And maybe he had come to me without even knowing the way. The trucks always arrived at dawn. It was an unwritten rule. Perhaps to avoid the crowds. Perhaps so no one had time to say goodbye properly. The tarpaulin would flap before the horn honked, and the sound of the wheels on the icy mud was enough to wake even the most weary bodies. That night, I already knew. Even before they heard my name, before they handed out the list, I knew he was on it. The superiors had taken inventory of the transportable wounded, those stable enough to proceed to the southernmost triage station, those with confirmed identities, clear documentation, and a known destination. The rest stayed, or disappeared, and he had never been in any of those categories. But somehow, his name, or rather, his absence, was beginning to bother them. There were too many eyes on his bed. A kind of hidden surveillance, a silent wait for something no one dared to name. I saw the doctor's movements, their restrained gestures, their wordless clipboards, and I knew they were trying to move him, not out of caution, but out of convenience, away from us, away from me, somewhere where his lack of answers wouldn't be anyone else's problem. When the designated soldier entered the tent and pointed at him, something inside me snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stepped between them. There was a firmness in my body I hadn't felt in years. My feet were firmly planted on the dirt floor, and my hands rested gently on the sheet. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. My silence was a no that came from within, from the part of me that refused to let go of what I didn't understand, but recognized. The soldier hesitated. The others pretended not to see. And for a moment, the war itself seemed to respect that space between us. He didn't look at me. He remained motionless, but his breathing changed, as if a weight had been released, as if for the first time he knew someone was willing to stay. The trucks left minutes later. They carried other bodies, other pains, other silences, but not his. Not that numberless body, that unmarked gaze. I stayed awake until sunrise, sitting beside the bed, the letter still hidden in my apron pocket. I knew I couldn't do it again, that I had broken an unwritten rule, but one that everyone obeyed. Still, I didn't regret it, because sometimes saving someone isn't about applying a bandage. It's about keeping them from disappearing again, even if you don't know what you're holding back, even if it costs you parts of yourself that will never return. It was a calm morning. Mist still shrouded the bushes outside, and the leaves creaked like old paper under the weight of dew. Nothing foretold that today would be any different. The hospital was silent, the nurse's rhythmic footsteps mingling with the sound of water being heated, and the slow spoonfuls of lukewarm soup being served in the back. When I entered the tent, the light filtering through the cracks already illuminated most of the beds. Some were empty. Others were filled with men groaning softly, fighting fevers. And his looked the same. His body stretched out, the blanket pulled up to his chest. The pillow sunk into the shape he had left it in every previous night. But something was wrong. There was a different stillness there, a kind of absence that didn't come from silence, but from the absence of presence. It was as if the space had been emptied from within, like a hollow shell that still holds the sound of the sea even after it's gone. I approached slowly. The mattress was still warm. The folds of the sheet were still marked, but he was no longer there. I searched with my eyes, with my gestures, with shallow breath. No trace, no note of removal. No nurse had taken him. No name was recorded during that shift change. His boot was still under the bed. His coat was on the hook. But he had disappeared, as if he had never been there. I asked discreetly. Everyone denied it. They said they hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything. And for the first time since the war began, I felt a kind of helplessness that had no color, no shape, Just wait. I spent the day trying not to think. But that night, I went to where I kept the personal belongings I'd secretly collected. I opened the drawer and took out the letter. The paper was drier now, more yellowed. But the words were still there, the same as before. And now, they felt even more like mine. Anne. I tried not to forget. Maybe he'd left on his own. Maybe someone had taken him without permission. Maybe he'd never been real, and it was all a juxtaposition of memory and necessity. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And most of all, I know what I lost. He left without saying his name, without returning what he took, without asking for anything. But he left a space inside me that has never been filled again. And I learned that not every absence follows a presence. Sometimes it comes along. It grows slowly. It sits at the table. It sleeps beside us. And it only reveals itself when we wake up too late, with the pillow still sunk, and our hearts fuller than can be explained. Today, at 88 years old and with a heart quieter than ever, I sometimes find myself staring out the kitchen window, as if still waiting for him to return. Not with his body, but with some part of what remained. Maybe a name, a gesture, a piece of meaning purposely left along the way. But it never came. And over time, I've come to understand that not everything that's lost is meant to be found again. That bed remains vivid in my memory. The pillow still sunk, the sheets slightly wrinkled, as if the warmth of a body had been extinguished prematurely. And what disturbs me most isn't the fact that he left. It's the way he did it, without a trace, without saying goodbye, without tying up any loose ends. As if he knew that, deep down, a part of me would never stop searching for him. There were days when I doubted my own memory, when I wondered if the scent of the perfume was just longing in disguise, if the map was real, if the letter had really been written for me, or if I simply saw in it what I needed to hear. But then the wind would change, the scent would return, and that sentence would beat in my chest again, the way his heart beat on the coldest nights, slowly, deeply, self-forgetful. Anne, I tried not to forget. Time has strange ways of stitching together the truth. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it reveals, other times it just leaves the thread loose, and we go on living with it stuck in the corner of our chest, like a label that can't be cut. War taught me many things. To mend wounds, to whisper calm where there was only pain, to keep my eyes dry when the whole world cried around me. But nothing prepared me for carrying someone inside me without knowing who he was. Today I live in silence among the trees of Vermont, with an old cat and memories sewn into the folds of the house. My days are filled with tea, books I can't finish, and a window that looks out onto nowhere. But every now and then, in that hour of dusk when everything seems suspended, I feel it. It passed through me. Again. Inside. And I understand finally that maybe his name never mattered. Maybe what connected us was this space between absences. His. Of remembering who he was. Mine. Of forgetting what I lost. And in that space, we found each other. If you've listened this far, I appreciate it. Because some stories don't survive alone. They need someone to embrace them. Someone who understands that it's not about finding answers. It's about sharing the weight of the questions. If this story has touched a nerve in you, maybe we're healing together, even without knowing it. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to comment. But if you want, write below the name of someone who disappeared from your life without explanation. Or just listen. That's enough. And if you feel like there are memories that only come alive when they're told, this channel is our safe place. A space for those who carry too much silence in their hearts. If you want to stay, subscribe. There are more stories like this. Or maybe exactly this one, told in a different way, by another woman who also never forgot what no one saw. Because sometimes, hiding someone is the only way we find to not lose ourselves.